The fluorescent lights of Sterling Memorial Hospital flickered once, just once, at exactly 11:47 p.m. on the night that would change everything. In the private maternity wing, where marble floors met Italian leather furniture, and where the average patient paid more for a single night than most families earned in a year, a sound emerged that would haunt everyone who heard it. It wasn't the cry of a newborn. It was silence. A silence so complete, so devastating, that even the machines seemed to hold their breath. And in that silence, surrounded by the finest medical equipment money could buy, attended by a team of 12 world-renowned specialists, Victoria Sterling, wife of Alexander Sterling, the most powerful man in American finance, took her last breath while bringing new life into the world. But here's what no one talks about. Here's what the newspapers never reported. Here's what the Sterling family buried beneath their mountain of money and influence. When that baby boy emerged into the world, covered in his mother's blood, not a single person in that room would touch him. Not the doctors who had been paid $250,000 for this delivery. Not the nurses who had signed confidentiality agreements thicker than medical textbooks. Not the family members who had gathered to celebrate. Not even the billionaire father who had promised his dying wife that he would love their child with everything he had. They all just stood there, frozen, paralyzed by grief, by shock, by something darker that none of them would ever admit. For 3 minutes and 47 seconds, an eternity in the life of a newborn, that baby lay on a cold metal tray, covered in blood, crying for a touch that wouldn't come, until she walked in. Her name was Grace Johnson, 53 years old. A night shift cleaning woman who had worked at Sterling Memorial for 27 years. A black woman in a hospital where people who looked like her rarely rose above service positions. A woman who earned in a month what the Sterling family spent on flowers. And she did what no one else in that room could bring themselves to do. She touched him, but what happened next, what unfolded over the following years, would shock everyone. Because the woman they dismissed as just the cleaning lady was about to teach the most powerful family in America something that all their billions could never buy. She was about to teach them how to love. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand who Alexander Sterling was, and more importantly, who he had become. At 42 years old, Alexander Sterling commanded a financial empire valued at $67 billion. His investment firm, Sterling Capital, had weathered 4 recessions, predicted 3 market crashes, and turned countless investors into millionaires. Magazine covers called him the King of Wall Street. Business schools used his strategies as case studies. World leaders sought his counsel on economic policy. But beneath the tailored suits and calculated smile was a man who had forgotten how to feel. Alexander had grown up in privilege so extreme that it warped his understanding of human connection. His father, Richard Sterling, had taught him that emotion was weakness, that relationships were transactions, and that people were either useful or irrelevant. The only thing that separates us from the masses, his father had said, is our ability to see people for what they really are, instruments to be used. For years, Alexander had lived by this philosophy, until Victoria. Victoria Chen had been different from any woman Alexander had ever met. A pediatric heart surgeon who had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, she didn't care about his money, wasn't impressed by his power, and refused to play the social games that dominated his world. Their first meeting had been a disaster and a revelation. At a charity gala, where Alexander was being honored for his donations, Victoria had publicly challenged him during his acceptance speech. "You've donated $10 million to this hospital," she had said, standing up in the middle of his address. "But last month, you successfully lobbied against a bill that would have provided health care to 300,000 children. Your donation is a tax write-off. Those children needed medicine." The room had gone silent. Alexander's security team moved toward her. His PR manager looked like she might faint. But Alexander, for the first time in his adult life, felt something crack open inside his chest. He invited Victoria to dinner that night. She refused. He tried again the next week. She refused again. For 3 months, he pursued her, not with expensive gifts or grand gestures, but with something far more valuable: genuine curiosity about who she was. When she finally agreed to have coffee with him, she laid down her terms. I don't need your money. I don't want your lifestyle. And I will never, ever stop calling you out when you're being a selfish jerk. Still interested? He was. Their relationship transformed him, or at least, it began to. Victoria challenged every assumption he had ever held. She took him to the neighborhoods where she had grown up, introduced him to patients who couldn't afford treatment, showed him the world that existed beyond his penthouse walls. The measure of a person, she told him once, isn't what they have. It's what they do when no one's watching. It's who they are to people who can do absolutely nothing for them. When Victoria became pregnant, Alexander made her a promise. Our child will know love, he said. Real love. Not transactions. Not calculations. I want to raise a human being, not a sterling. Victoria had smiled, her hand on her growing belly. Then you're going to have to learn how to be a human being first. She had been right. And he had been trying. For 8 beautiful months, he had been trying to become the man she believed he could be. Then came the complications. Then came that night. Then came the silence. The doctors had warned them that the pregnancy was high risk. Victoria's heart condition, a minor defect she had managed her entire life, became dangerous under the strain of carrying the baby. We can terminate, the specialist had said. It's the safest option for Victoria. But Victoria refused. I've spent my career saving children's hearts, she said. I'm not going to stop now. Alexander had begged her to reconsider. His mother, Eleanor Sterling, a woman who had never approved of Victoria, had been more direct. She's being selfish, Eleanor said, risking her life for a baby that could be conceived again through safer means. It's foolish. Victoria overheard. She didn't flinch. With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling, she replied, there's no safer means of creating love, and that's what this baby is. He's love. I would die 1,000 times for him. On the night of October 15th, those words became prophecy. The labor began normally. The team assembled from the finest hospitals in the country was confident. The private suite had been outfitted with equipment more sophisticated than some entire medical centers. But human bodies don't care about wealth. Death doesn't accept bribes. At 11:41 p.m., Victoria's heart began to fail. The next 6 minutes were chaos. Doctors shouting orders. Machines screaming alerts. Alexander being pushed against a wall by nurses who needed room to work. At 11:47 p.m., they made the impossible choice. We can save the baby, the lead surgeon said, his face pale. But Victoria, save her, Alexander screamed. Save my wife. Sir, her heart. There's nothing the damage is to. Save them both. I'll pay anything. I'll give you anything. But there was nothing to give. Nothing to pay. Some prices exist beyond the reach of billions. They saved the baby. At 11:47 p.m., as her son took his first breath, Victoria Sterling took her last. And then came the silence. The newborn lay on the medical tray, still connected to his mother by a cord that no one had cut, covered in blood that no one would wipe away. He cried. A thin, desperate sound. The universal language of a human being who has entered a cold world and found it unwelcoming. The doctors stood paralyzed. They had just watched a woman die. A woman they had promised to save. The trauma response kicked in fight, flight, or freeze. They chose freeze. The nurses looked to the doctors for direction. None came. Alexander sat slumped in a chair where his security team had placed him after he collapsed. He stared at the wall, his eyes seeing nothing, his mind shattered into 1,000 pieces that would take years to reassemble. Eleanor Sterling had rushed in from the waiting room when she heard the code called. She stood in the doorway, her designer dress pressed against the frame, her face arranged in an expression she had perfected over 7 decades. Controlled displeasure. She looked at the baby, her grandson, and felt nothing. No, that wasn't quite true. She felt something. Disgust. This child had killed her chance to finally control her son. Victoria had been an obstacle to Eleanor's influence, and this child, this screaming, bloody reminder of the woman Eleanor had despised, was Victoria's final victory. "Someone clean that up," Eleanor said, her voice ice. "And find a proper nurse. Not one of these." She gestured vaguely at the shell-shocked medical team. "These incompetents." But no one moved. The head nurse, a woman named Patricia Wells who had worked in elite medicine for 30 years, later confessed in her retirement interview that she couldn't explain her paralysis. "I've delivered over 1,000 babies," she said. "I've handled emergencies that would make your hair turn white. But that night, it was like there was a wall between me and that child. Like if I touched him, I'd be touching death itself." The baby's cries grew weaker. In the first minutes of life, newborns can lose body heat rapidly. They need skin-to-skin contact, warmth, the reassurance of human touch. This baby was receiving none of it. 2 minutes passed. Then 3, and that's when the door opened. Grace Johnson had been mopping the hallway outside the private maternity suite when she heard the code called. She had pressed herself against the wall as doctors and equipment rushed past, had stood in silent prayer as the minutes ticked by, had felt her heart break when she heard the time of death announced. She knew she should leave. She was just the cleaning lady. She had no business being anywhere near this situation. The Sterling family had enough lawyers to ruin her life if she overstepped. But then she heard the baby crying. And she heard something else, or rather, the absence of something else. She heard no one comforting that child. Grace had raised 4 children of her own. She had 7 grandchildren. She had spent her entire life caring for people not because it was her job, but because it was her calling. The paychecks were just a bonus. She had also spent her entire life being invisible to people like the Sterlings. In 27 years at this hospital, not a single wealthy patient had ever looked her in the eye. They looked through her, around her, past her, as if she were another piece of furniture to be cleaned around. She had made peace with that. "The Lord sees me," she would tell her children. "That's enough." But right now, in this moment, there was a baby who needed to be seen. Grace pushed open the door. The scene that greeted her would stay with her for the rest of her life. The doctors, frozen like statues. The nurses, clutching each other. The billionaire, broken. The grandmother, cold as stone. And on a metal tray, surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment, a newborn baby lay alone, covered in his dead mother's blood, crying for help that wasn't coming. Grace didn't think. She didn't calculate the risks, consider the consequences, or worry about her job. She walked straight to that baby. Now, she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence like warm honey. "What's all this fussing about, little one?" Eleanor Sterling's voice cracked like a whip. "What do you think you're doing? Security. Get this woman out of here." Grace ignored her. With hands that had bathed 7 grandchildren, hands that had held her dying mother, hands that had worked until the skin cracked and bled to provide for her family, hands that the world considered unimportant, Grace Johnson reached down and lifted the baby from the tray. "Don't you dare touch him," Eleanor shrieked. "Do you know who we are? Do you know what we could do to you? Put him down this instant." Grace still didn't look at her. She had learned long ago that some people weren't worth the energy of acknowledgement. Instead, she looked at the baby, really looked at him. Beneath the blood and vernix, she saw a perfect little face scrunched up in distress. She saw tiny fingers grasping at air, searching for something to hold. "It's all right," she whispered. "I've got you. You're not alone." The baby's cries began to soften. "Someone get her away from my grandson." Eleanor was advancing now, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. But then another voice spoke. Quiet, broken, but absolute. "Let her." Everyone turned to look at Alexander Sterling. He had risen from his chair, his legs unsteady, his face a mask of devastation. His eyes were fixed on Grace Johnson, on the way she held his son, on the gentleness in her weathered hands. "Alex, you can't be serious," Eleanor said. "This woman is a cleaning lady. She's covered and look at her uniform. It's filthy. She has no medical training. No authority to let her. Something in Alexander's voice silenced even Eleanor. He walked forward slowly, each step costing him what felt like years of his life. He stopped in front of Grace, looking down at the baby she held. His son, his and Victoria's son. Can you? His voice cracked. He tried again. Can you clean him? Make him? Make him comfortable? Grace finally looked up, meeting Alexander Sterling's eyes. In 27 years, no one in this hospital with his kind of money had ever looked at her like this. Not with superiority, not with dismissal, not with the casual cruelty of the privileged. Alexander Sterling looked at her like she was the only person in the world who could help him. I can, Grace said simply. She turned to the nurse's station, where warm water and soft cloths waited. The medical staff parted for her like the Red Sea, still paralyzed by their own trauma, grateful that anyone was taking action. And Grace Johnson, the night shift cleaning woman who had never been invited to a Sterling function, who had never been acknowledged by the powerful people she served, who had spent her life being invisible. She gave Alexander Sterling's son his first bath. Grace worked with quiet efficiency, her movements practiced by decades of motherhood and grandmotherhood. She tested the water temperature against her wrist, a motion so instinctive she could have done it in her sleep. She gathered soft cloths, remembering how sensitive a newborn's skin could be. She checked the baby's umbilical cord, ensuring it had been properly clamped. The medical staff watched in silence. Some with shame, some with relief, some with a confused mix of both. Eleanor Sterling watched with barely concealed fury, and Alexander Sterling watched with something that felt foreign to him, something that, if he could have identified it, he might have called hope. There now, Grace murmured as she lowered the baby into the warm water, supporting his head with the practiced ease of experience. That feels better, doesn't it? The baby's cries had stopped entirely. He looked up at Grace with unfocused newborn eyes, his tiny body relaxing in the warmth. You're going to be just fine, Grace continued, gently washing away the blood that had horrified everyone else. You came into this world fighting, didn't you? Your mama gave everything she had to bring you here. That means you've got strength in your bones. You've got love in your heart. Alexander's breath caught. Grace continued to speak softly to the baby as she cleaned him, her words forming a lullaby of comfort. I know it's scary. Being born is scary. The world is cold and loud and bright, and none of it makes sense yet. But here's what you need to know. Little one, you are loved, you are wanted, and whatever comes next, that's never going to change. She paused, reaching for a fresh cloth. Your mama isn't here to tell you that herself. And I'm sorry for that. I'm so sorry. But I truly believe, she's watching over you right now. She's seeing this first bath. She's seeing you get clean and warm and safe. And she's proud. She's so proud. Tears were falling down Alexander's face. He didn't notice. He couldn't have stopped them if he tried. Grace lifted the baby from the water, wrapped him in a soft towel, and began to dry him with gentle patting motions. There now. Look at you. Look at how perfect you are. She turned to face Alexander, the clean, calm baby cradled in her arms. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice professional but warm. Would you like to hold your son? Alexander froze. The same paralysis that had gripped everyone else now held him. The baby, this small, fragile creature who represented everything he had lost and everything he had promised, seemed impossibly delicate, impossibly precious, impossibly terrifying. I don't. You won't break him, Grace said, as if reading his thoughts. He's stronger than he looks. Babies always are. I've never held a baby before, Alexander admitted, his voice small. A murmur ran through the medical staff. The head nurse, Patricia Wells, later said it was the most vulnerable thing she had ever heard a powerful man admit. Grace smiled a warm, patient smile that had comforted children and grandchildren through countless fears. Then let me show you. She stepped close to Alexander and gently transferred the baby into his arms, guiding his hands into the proper position, one supporting the head, one supporting the bottom. "Just like that," she said. "See? You're doing perfectly." Alexander looked down at his son. The baby looked up at his father. And something shifted in the universe. Something small but significant. A connection formed between two broken souls, one who had just lost everything, and one who had just entered a world that had greeted him with cold silence. "Hello," Alexander whispered, his voice cracking. I'm your dad." The baby blinked. I know I'm not good at this. I know I wasn't ready. But your mother believed in me. She thought I could be better. And I'm going to try. I'm going to try so hard. For you. For her. For all of us." He pulled the baby closer, pressing his lips to the impossibly soft skin of his son's forehead. "I'm going to name you Noah," he said. "Because your mother loved that name. She said it meant rest and comfort. She said whoever wore that name would bring peace to everyone around them." He looked up at Grace, tears still streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said. I don't know how to thank you enough." Grace shook her head. "No thanks needed, Mr. Sterling. I just did what anyone would do." "No." Alexander's voice was firm despite his tears. "That's not true. You did what no one else would do. You saw my son when everyone else looked away. You touched him when everyone else was afraid. That's not nothing. That's everything." Eleanor Sterling stepped forward, her face a careful mask. "Alex, you're emotional. Understandably so. We should let the medical team take over now. This woman has done, well, she's done something. Certainly. But professionals should." "Mother." Alexander's voice was cold in a way it had never been before. "Stop talking." Eleanor's mouth fell open. "This woman," Alexander continued, looking at Grace, "showed my son more compassion in 10 minutes than you have shown anyone in 70 years. And I will never forget that." He turned to the head nurse, who was still standing frozen near the door. "I want her information. This woman's employment file, her contact information, everything. And I want to know why. Not a single person in this room. People I paid a fortune to care for my wife and child. Why not a single one of you could do what she did?" Patricia Wells began to stammer an explanation. But Alexander wasn't listening anymore. He was looking at his son, and Grace Johnson was quietly gathering her cleaning supplies, ready to return to work as if she hadn't just changed the course of a dynasty. "Wait." She turned back. Alexander Sterling, holding his son, looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What's your name?" "Grace, sir. Grace Johnson." He nodded slowly, as if committing the name to permanent memory. "Grace," he repeated. "My wife would have liked you. She would have liked you very much." Grace smiled softly. "I think I would have liked her too, sir." She slipped out of the room, leaving behind the chaos and the grief and the complicated emotions of the ultra-wealthy. Behind her, she heard Eleanor Sterling's sharp voice resume its criticism. But she also heard something else, something that made all the invisible years worth it. She heard Alexander Sterling whisper to his son, "Did you see her, Noah? Did you see how she held you? That's what real love looks like. That's what real strength is. Remember that. Always remember that." Grace Johnson walked down the hallway, returned her cleaning supplies to the cart, and resumed mopping the floor she had abandoned when she heard a baby crying. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. And so was Noah Sterling's. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, a letter arrived at Grace Johnson's modest apartment in the Bronx. It was delivered by private courier, a young man in a crisp uniform who looked deeply uncomfortable standing in front of a building with a broken buzzer and graffiti on the walls. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, expensive. The kind of paper that cost more per sheet than Grace earned per hour. Inside was a single page, typed in elegant font. "Mrs. Johnson, your services at Sterling Memorial Hospital are no longer required. Your final paycheck, along with 2 weeks severance, has been deposited into your account. Please return your employee badge and any hospital property within 48 hours. We wish you well in your future endeavors. Human Resources Department. No explanation, no warning, no gratitude for 27 years of faithful service. Grace read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a quiet, weary understanding. She knew exactly who was behind this. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that this termination wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning, because at that very moment, 3 miles away, in a penthouse that overlooked Central Park, Alexander Sterling was discovering something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman who saved his son. Grace Johnson wasn't just a cleaning lady. She never had been. Alexander Sterling hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a time since Victoria's death. His days were consumed with Noah, a baby who seemed to sense that something was wrong, who cried more than the nurses said was normal, who only seemed to calm when someone held him close and spoke to him softly. And his nights were consumed with something else entirely: obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about Grace Johnson. Not in a romantic way, his heart was too shattered, too devoted to Victoria's memory for anything like that. But something about that night haunted him. The way she had moved without hesitation, the way she had spoken to Noah, the way she had looked at him, not with the fear or reverence that everyone else showed, but with something that felt uncomfortably like pity, understanding, recognition. He had asked his assistant to pull her employee file. The request should have been simple. It wasn't. Grace Johnson's file was unusually thin. Hire date: the 15th of January 1998. Position: custodial services. Night shift. Next of kin: Marcus Johnson. Deceased. Husband: emergency contact, Denise Williams, daughter. That was it. No performance reviews. No disciplinary actions. No commendations. 27 years of work, and the hospital had kept almost no record of her existence. Alexander found this deeply unsettling. His company kept detailed files on every employee: their skills, their growth, their contributions. The idea that a human being could work somewhere for nearly 3 decades and leave so little trace. He asked his private investigation team to dig deeper. They came back with results that made him sit down. "Sir," the lead investigator said, placing a thick folder on Alexander's desk, "this is one of the most interesting backgrounds we've ever researched." Alexander opened the folder and began to read. Grace Marie Johnson, née Williams. Born the 15th of March, 1972, in Montgomery, Alabama. Education: bachelor's degree in nursing, Tuskegee University, 1994. Graduated summa cum laude. Certification: registered nurse, State of Alabama, 1994. License transferred to New York State, 1997. Employment history: 1994 to 1997. Montgomery General Hospital, Pediatric ICU. Rated exceptional in all performance reviews. Credited with saving 17 lives during a hospital power outage in 1996. Then the record went dark. "What happened in 1997? Alexander asked. The investigator shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, this is where it gets complicated." He handed over a newspaper clipping from the Montgomery Gazette, dated the 18th of November 1997. Hospital nurse suspended after saving wrong life. Grace Johnson, 25, a pediatric nurse at Montgomery General Hospital, has been placed on indefinite suspension following an incident in which she allegedly provided emergency care to a patient without proper authorization. According to hospital administration, Johnson left her assigned station in the pediatric ICU to render aid to an adult male in the emergency room who was experiencing cardiac arrest. Hospital policy requires nurses to remain in their designated areas and defer to emergency room staff. While we do not dispute that Mrs. Johnson's actions may have contributed to the patient's survival, said Hospital Director Richard Marks, We cannot condone willful disregard of established protocols. The patient, whose identity has not been released, is reported to be in stable condition. Johnson's nursing license is currently under review by the state board. Alexander looked up from the clipping. She was suspended for saving someone's life? There's more, sir. Keep reading. The next clipping, dated the 2nd of December 1997. Nurse's license revoked after controversy. The Alabama State Board of Nursing has revoked the license of Grace Johnson, citing unprofessional conduct and violation of institutional protocols. Johnson, who was suspended last month after leaving her station to save a cardiac arrest patient, maintains that she acted appropriately. The emergency room was understaffed, Johnson said in a statement. The patient was dying. I had the training to help. I don't regret my decision. The identity of the patient Johnson treated remains undisclosed. However, sources indicate that the individual was a prominent member of the Montgomery community. Alexander felt something cold settling in his stomach. Who was the patient? The investigator handed over one more document, a hospital intake form with most of the information redacted, except for one name that had been highlighted. Richard Sterling III, Alexander's grandfather. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at the document. His grandfather, the man who had built the Sterling Empire, the man who had died when Alexander was just 12 years old, who had always seemed invincible, immortal, a titan who had taught him that power was the only thing that mattered. Grace Johnson had saved his life, and his family had destroyed her career in return. Sir, the investigator continued, there's more. After her license was revoked, Mrs. Johnson moved to New York with her husband, Marcus. He had family here. She took the only job she could get without nursing credentials, custodial work at Sterling Memorial Hospital. Alexander's voice was hoarse. Sterling Memorial. We founded that hospital. Yes, sir. Your family donated the land and the initial funding in 1952. It's been associated with the Sterling name ever since. Grace Johnson had spent 27 years cleaning floors in a hospital named after the family that had ruined her nursing career. 27 years of being invisible. 27 years of watching others do the work she had been trained for, had excelled at, had been born to do. And when Alexander's son needed help when everyone else had failed, she had stepped forward anyway. Why didn't she say anything? Alexander whispered. Why didn't she tell someone who she really was? The investigator shrugged. People don't usually share their traumas with their employers, sir. Especially not when those employers are the ones who caused the trauma. Alexander's hands were shaking. His entire worldview, already cracked by Victoria's death, was fracturing further. All his life, he had been taught that the Sterlings were good people. Demanding? Yes. Hard, certainly. But ultimately, moral. Ultimately, fair. This document told a different story. His grandfather had been saved by a young black nurse who broke protocol to do what was right. And the Sterling family, or someone connected to them, had ensured that she was punished for it. I need to find her, Alexander said. I need to talk to her. Sir, there's one more thing you should know. The investigator's expression was grave. Mrs. Johnson was terminated from Sterling Memorial 3 days ago. The order came from someone in your family's foundation, the same foundation that provides the hospital's primary funding. The termination was immediate and without cause. Alexander closed his eyes. Mother, Eleanor Sterling, was hosting a charity luncheon when Alexander arrived at the Sterling family estate. The grand ballroom was filled with the usual suspects: society wives, corporate executives, ambitious politicians. All dressed in expensive clothes, all talking about expensive things, all utterly convinced of their own importance. Alexander walked through them without seeing them. He found his mother at the head table, holding court with a cluster of admirers who laughed at her every word. Alexander. Eleanor's smile was perfect, warm enough to appear genuine, controlled enough to hide everything beneath. What a wonderful surprise. I didn't expect you to leave Noah so soon after. We need to talk, now. The steel in his voice silenced the table. Eleanor's smile flickered, but held. Of course, darling. Let me just... Now. He turned and walked toward the library without waiting to see if she followed. She did, of course. Eleanor Sterling had never been able to resist a confrontation. The library doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. This had better be important, Alexander. I have 300 guests who... He threw the folder on her desk. Eleanor picked it up, glanced through it, and set it down again. Her expression didn't change. Ah, she said. I wondered when you'd find out. You knew? Of course I knew. I've known for years. She saved grandfather's life and disrupted the entire hospital in the process. Created a scandal that took months to manage. Made us look foolish. She made us look foolish by saving a man's life? Eleanor's voice was ice. She made us look foolish by forcing us to acknowledge that a black cleaning woman, a nurse who had been out of her area, mind you, is more competent than our entire medical staff. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? How it undermined confidence in the hospital we had built? Alexander stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. So you had her license revoked. I had nothing to do with that. That was your grandfather's decision. After he recovered. He understood what I'm trying to explain to you. Reputation is everything. If people believe they can break rules without consequences, society collapses. He was dying. She saved him. Those are the only facts that matter. Eleanor sighed, as if dealing with a particularly slow child. Alexander, darling, you've always been too sentimental. It's why Victoria was able to manipulate you so easily. Some people are meant to serve, some people are meant to lead. When the servants forget their place, chaos ensues. Victoria never manipulated me. She was the best thing that ever happened to me. Victoria was a lovely girl with excellent surgical skills and absolutely no understanding of our world. She filled your head with ridiculous notions about equality and compassion. And now look at you falling apart over a cleaning woman who touched your baby. She didn't just touch him, Mother. She was the only one who would touch him. While your doctor stood frozen, while you stood in the doorway complaining about her uniform, she held my son. She cleaned him. She comforted him. She did what none of you, what I could do. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. A momentary lapse. Everyone was in shock. Under normal circumstances, you would have let my son lie alone on a metal tray, rather than acknowledge that someone you considered beneath you was capable of compassion. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's mask slipped, revealing something cold and hard beneath. Be very careful, Alexander. I have been patient with your grief. I have tolerated your attachment to that woman's memory. But if you think for one moment that I will allow you to elevate some servant to, you're fired. Eleanor blinked. I beg your pardon? From the foundation, from the hospital board, from any and all Sterling family business. You're fired. You can't do that. I'm your mother. You were my mother. Right now, you're just someone who destroyed a woman's career for doing the right thing. Who fired her 27 years later for doing the right thing again, and who has spent your entire life teaching me that cruelty is acceptable as long as you have enough money to hide it. He picked up the folder from her desk. I'm taking this, and I'm going to find Grace Johnson, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows that what happened to her was wrong, and that not all Sterlings are monsters. He was at the door when Eleanor's voice stopped him. If you do this, if you side with that woman against your own family, there will be consequences. I have resources. I have connections. I can make your life very difficult. Alexander turned back, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something in her son's eyes that frightened her. Mother, he said quietly, I just watched my wife die. I just held my newborn son while covered in her blood. There is nothing you can threaten me with that scares me anymore. The worst thing in my life has already happened. Everything else is just noise. He walked out, leaving Eleanor Sterling alone in her library, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power that suddenly seemed very cold, very empty, and very small. Grace Johnson's apartment building had no doorman, no security system, no marble floors. It had a broken elevator, peeling paint, and neighbors who looked at Alexander Sterling's limousine like it might be a drug dealer's car. Alexander didn't care. He walked up 4 flights of stairs, the elevator was broken, a handwritten sign explained, and knocked on apartment 4C. The door opened a crack, held by a chain. Yes, Mrs. Johnson, it's Alexander Sterling. From the hospital. A pause. Then the chain rattled, and the door opened fully. Grace stood there, in a simple house dress, her hair tied back, her face showing the same quiet dignity she had displayed on the worst night of Alexander's life. Mr. Sterling, I wasn't expecting you. I know. I apologize for showing up unannounced. May I come in? She hesitated, and Alexander suddenly understood what that hesitation meant. A black woman, alone in her apartment, being asked to let in a white billionaire she barely knew. The power dynamics. The history. The risk. I can stay in the hallway if you prefer, he said quickly. I need to talk to you. About what happened. About everything. Grace studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped back. Come in. I just made coffee. The apartment was small but immaculate. Every surface gleamed. Plants sat in the windows, herbs, mostly, with a few flowers struggling toward the light. Photos covered one wall. Children, grandchildren, wedding pictures, graduation ceremonies. A lifetime of love, captured in frames. In the center of one cluster was a photo of a young Grace in a nursing uniform, standing proudly in front of a hospital. Please, sit. Grace gestured to a worn but comfortable couch. How do you take your coffee? Black is fine, thank you. She brought him a cup in a chipped mug that said, Hashon Grandma, and sat across from him in a rocking chair that had clearly seen decades of use. How is Noah? She asked. Alexander's breath caught at the unexpected kindness. He's struggling. He cries a lot. The doctors say it's colic. But I wonder if somehow he knows. Grace nodded slowly. Babies know more than we give them credit for. They feel what we feel. They absorb our grief, our fear, our love. He needs time and patience and someone who will hold him through the hard nights. I'm trying. I'm not very good at it. No one is at first. The good ones are the ones who keep trying anyway. Alexander looked down at his coffee cup, gathering courage. Mrs. Johnson, Grace, I know what happened to you. In Montgomery, in 1997. Grace's hands tightened on her own cup, the only sign of tension. I know you saved my grandfather's life. And I know what my family did to you in return. Silence. I can't apologize for what happened. Alexander continued. An apology would be an insult. 27 years of your life. A career you loved. Skills you were born to use. No apology can give that back. Grace's voice was quiet but steady. No, it can't. But I can try to make things right. Starting now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is a check. It's not compensation. Nothing could compensate you. But it's a start. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And there's more. He pulled out a second document. This is a letter from the New York State Board of Nursing. My lawyers have been in contact with them. They've reviewed your case and the circumstances of your license revocation. Given the irregularities in how that process was handled, they've agreed to reinstate your nursing credentials immediately. Grace's cup trembled in her hands. You can't. I can. I did. It's already done. If you want to go back to nursing, Grace, there's nothing stopping you. If you want to retire, you can do that too. Whatever you want, it's yours. Tears were falling down Grace's face now, the first tears she had allowed herself to shed over this in 27 years. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? Alexander set down his cup and leaned forward. Because my wife spent her whole life fighting for people like you. People who did the right thing and got punished for it. People who were invisible to the rest of the world. Victoria would never forgive me if I didn't try to fix what my family broke. He paused, struggling with his next words. And because of Noah, because when I think about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of man I want my son to become, I think about you. standing in that delivery room, surrounded by people who wouldn't act, and acting anyway. That's the kind of person I want Noah to grow up to be. Someone who does what's right, even when everyone else is paralyzed by fear or prejudice or selfishness. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Your wife must have been something special, she said. She was. She really was. She saw something in you, worth fighting for. She did. I'm still not sure she was right. Grace shook her head slowly. She was right. You just haven't figured out how to believe it yet. She looked at the documents in her hands, the check, the nursing license reinstatement. I don't know if I can accept this. Why not? Because I didn't do what I did for money, or credit, or recognition. I did it because there was a baby who needed help. That's all. That's the whole reason. I know. That's exactly why you should accept it. Because you deserve to be rewarded for being good, not punished for it. The world should work that way. It usually doesn't, but it should. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at Alexander with those clear, wise eyes. There is something I want. Something more valuable than any check. Name it. Let me see Noah again. Let me hold him. Let me. She stopped, embarrassed. That sounds foolish. I know. A stranger, asking to hold your child. It doesn't sound foolish at all. Alexander pulled out his phone and made a call. Bring Noah to the address I'm sending you. Yes, now. Yes, it's safe. I'll explain later. He hung up and looked at Grace. He'll be here in 20 minutes. For the second time that day, Grace Johnson cried. When Noah arrived, held by a nervous nanny who had clearly never visited a neighborhood like this, Grace's apartment transformed. All the tension, all the sadness, all the weight of the past it lifted, just for a moment. Grace took Noah in her arms like she had done 3 weeks ago. And the baby who had cried through most of his young life, who had rarely been calm for more than a few minutes at a time, went still. He looked up at Grace with those unfocused newborn eyes. And something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. Or simply the instinctive understanding that this was someone safe. There you are, Grace whispered. There's my beautiful boy. Alexander watched, tears streaming down his face, as the woman his family had wronged sang softly to the son his wife had died to give him. She sang an old spiritual something her grandmother had taught her, something that had survived slavery and Jim Crow and poverty and heartbreak, passed down through generations of strong women who refused to let the world break them. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, she sang softly. A long way from home. A long way from home. Noah's eyes began to close. But then I remember that I'm never alone. Never alone. Never alone. The baby slept. It was the longest he had slept since his birth. Later, after Noah had been fed and changed and put down in a portable crib that Grace had produced from her closet, from when my grandchildren were babies, I never throw anything useful away. Alexander and Grace sat together in her small kitchen. I have a proposal, Alexander said. And I want you to know that you can say no, and I'll respect that completely. I'm listening. I need help with Noah. Professional help. The nannies we've hired are qualified, but they treat him like a task to be completed, not a child to be loved. He took a deep breath. I want you to come work for me. Not as a maid. Not as a cleaning lady. As Noah's caregiver. His nanny. His grandmother. If that's not too presumptuous. Grace's eyes widened. Mr. Sterling. Alexander, please. Alexander. I'm 53 years old. I've spent the last 27 years mopping floors. I'm not sure I remember how to. You remembered 3 weeks ago. In that delivery room, you remembered everything. Grace fell silent. I'm not asking you to replace anyone, Alexander continued. Victoria was going to be his mother, and nothing can change that. But she's gone. And I'm broken. I'm trying to put myself back together. But it's going to take time. Maybe a long time. Noah needs someone stable, someone warm, someone who will love him not because they're paid to, but because that's who they are. He reached across the table and took Grace's weathered hand in his. You saved my son's life that night, Grace. Not physically, the doctors did that, but spiritually. You showed him that the world isn't as cold as it seemed in those first terrible minutes. You showed him that there are people who will reach out to him in love, no matter what everyone else does. His voice cracked. Please, let me give you the chance to keep showing him that. Let me try to be the kind of man, the kind of Sterling, who deserves the second chance you've given my family. Grace looked at this broken, desperate, grieving man who sat in her humble kitchen holding her hand. She thought about 27 years of invisibility, of watching babies in the hospital, and wondering what had happened to the ones she had saved in Montgomery, of a career stolen and a life derailed. She thought about Eleanor Sterling and the cruelty of the powerful. She thought about Noah's face as he slept in her arms. And she thought about Victoria, a woman she had never met, but somehow understood, who had seen something worth saving in this lost, privileged man. Yes, Grace said, I'll do it. The news of Grace Johnson's hiring spread through the Sterling social circles like wildfire. Alexander had expected criticism. He hadn't expected war. Eleanor Sterling, stripped of her official positions but not her influence, mobilized her network. Society pages ran thinly, veiled articles questioning Alexander's judgment. Old family friends called to express concern about that woman who had inserted herself into the Sterling household. The whisper campaign was vicious and effective. He's clearly suffering a breakdown. Grief does strange things to people. A black woman from the Bronx raising the Sterling heir? It's unprecedented. She probably manipulated him. These people know how to take advantage. Alexander ignored it all. He was learning that the opinions of people who had never truly loved anyone were worth exactly nothing. What he couldn't ignore was the lawsuit. 3 weeks after Grace moved into the Sterling penthouse into a private suite that was larger than her entire Bronx apartment, Eleanor's lawyers filed an emergency motion seeking custody of Noah. The grounds: Alexander Sterling was experiencing severe mental disturbance, evidenced by his erratic decision-making and association with unsuitable individuals. The unsuitable individual, of course, was Grace. Alexander received the summons on a Tuesday morning. He read it twice, his face going pale, then red, then pale again. She can't do this, he said to his lawyer. She can't take my son. She can try, sir. And she has resources, connections to judges, a history of getting what she wants. Alexander looked through the window of his office at Central Park, spread out below like a green carpet. Somewhere in the penthouse behind him, Grace was singing to Noah. Then we fight, he said quietly. We fight, and we win. Sir, this could get ugly. Eleanor will drag everything into the open. The night of the birth, Grace's history, your own mental state, Victoria's decision to continue the pregnancy, everything. Let her, sir. I said let her. Alexander turned to face his lawyer, and his expression was harder than it had ever been. My mother has spent her entire life believing that money and power can overcome anything, that the rules don't apply to people like us. It's time someone showed her she's wrong. He walked to his desk and sat down. Find me everything. Every secret she's ever kept, every shady deal, every person she's ever destroyed. If she wants a war, I'll give her a war. And Grace? She'll be called to testify. Her past will be examined. It could be traumatic for her. Alexander's voice softened. I'll talk to her. If she wants to walk away, I won't blame her. This isn't her fight. But even as he said it, he knew what Grace would say. Some people don't walk away from children who need them. Some people never have. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. Every standing space was occupied. Outside, crowds pressed against the barriers, held back by security guards who had been hired specifically for this moment. The case of Sterling v. Sterling had become a national obsession. It had everything: a grieving billionaire, a scheming matriarch, a mysterious black caregiver, and a baby boy whose future hung in the balance. The media had dubbed it the trial of the century, a title that was probably hyperbolic, but not by much. At the defendant's table sat Alexander Sterling, looking thinner than he had 6 months ago, his eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before Victoria's death. At the plaintiff's table sat Eleanor Sterling, immaculate in designer clothing, her face arranged in an expression of concerned grandmotherly love that fooled absolutely no one who knew her. And in the gallery, dressed in a simple blue dress that had been bought at a department store but somehow looked more dignified than all of Eleanor's couture combined, sat Grace Johnson. She was about to take the stand, and what she was about to reveal would change everything. The custody hearing had been going on for 3 days when Grace was called to testify. Eleanor's lawyers had been brutal. They had painted Alexander as unstable, irrational, and dangerously influenced by outside elements. They had brought in psychiatrists who testified about the effects of grief on decision-making. They had produced financial analysts who questioned Alexander's recent business choices. But the heart of their case was Grace. "Mrs. Johnson," Eleanor's lead attorney began, his voice smooth with practiced contempt. "You are currently employed as a caregiver for the Sterling heir. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. I care for Noah. And before that, you were a cleaning woman at Sterling Memorial Hospital for 27 years. Is that also correct?" "Yes, sir. A cleaning woman." The attorney let the words hang in the air. "Mopping floors. Emptying trash. That kind of work?" "That kind of work, yes. And now, somehow, you've been elevated to caring for one of the wealthiest children in America. Quite a rise, wouldn't you say?" Alexander's lawyer objected, but the damage was being done. The attorney's tone made it clear what he was implying, that Grace had manipulated a grieving man, had inserted herself into a situation where she didn't belong, had taken advantage of tragedy for personal gain. Grace remained calm through all of it. She had faced worse than this. She had faced much worse. "Mrs. Johnson, let me be direct. Do you believe you are qualified to care for a child of Noah Sterling's status?" "I believe I am qualified to care for any child who needs love." "That's a lovely sentiment. But Noah Sterling isn't just any child. He will inherit billions of dollars. He will be educated at the finest institutions. He will move in circles that someone from your background could never understand." Grace looked at the attorney with steady eyes. "Sir, I've spent my entire life understanding things that people from your background thought I couldn't understand. I'm still here. That should tell you something." A murmur went through the courtroom. Alexander suppressed a smile. The attorney pressed on. "Let's talk about your background, Mrs. Johnson. You were a nurse once, weren't you? In Alabama?" "Yes, sir." "And you lost your nursing license. Isn't that correct?" "It was revoked." "Yes, revoked. Because you violated hospital protocol. Because you couldn't follow simple rules. Because I saved a man's life when no one else would." "That's your interpretation. The official record shows that you were disciplined for leaving your station and interfering with emergency room procedures. The official record was written by people who wanted me gone." The attorney smiled a cold, predatory smile. "Mrs. Johnson, isn't it true that the patient whose care you interfered with was a member of the Sterling family?" The courtroom went silent. "Yes," Grace said quietly. "It was Richard Sterling III, Mr. Alexander Sterling's grandfather." The murmur that went through the crowd was louder this time. Even the judge leaned forward. "So, let me make sure I understand," the attorney said. "You claim that you saved the life of Alexander Sterling's grandfather. And then, what? The family destroyed your career as a reward?" "That's exactly what happened. And yet you continued to work at Sterling Memorial Hospital for 27 years. A hospital founded by the same family. Doesn't that seem strange?" Grace's voice was steady. "I needed a job. I had a husband and children to support. The hospital was hiring, and they didn't ask too many questions about my past. I did my work. I kept my head down, and I survived." "You survived. And now, all these years later, you've managed to position yourself as the caregiver for the Sterling heir. Quite a coincidence. There's no coincidence about it, sir. A baby needed help. I helped him. That's all. And in doing so, you've secured yourself a position of power and influence in one of America's wealthiest families. You've moved from the Bronx to a Central Park penthouse. You've traded mops and buckets for designer clothes and private jets. Grace's eyes flashed the first sign of emotion she had shown. I'm wearing a dress from Macy's, sir. I've never been on a private jet, and the penthouse has a very nice room that I use to sleep and be close to Noah when he needs me at night. If that's power and influence, then I suppose I have it. But it's not what I wanted. What did you want, Mrs. Johnson? Grace looked past the attorney, past Eleanor Sterling's smug face, past the cameras and the crowds. She looked directly at Alexander, who sat with tears forming in his eyes. Then she looked at the gallery, where Denise, her daughter, sat holding her own children's hands. I wanted what I've always wanted, Grace said. To be useful. To help. To do some good in a world that tries very hard to stop people like me from doing good. That's all. That's everything. The attorney opened his mouth to respond, but he never got the chance. Your Honor, Alexander's lawyer said, standing. We would like to introduce new evidence. Evidence that directly contradicts the plaintiff's characterization of Mrs. Johnson, and evidence that reveals the true nature of this custody dispute. The judge looked intrigued. What kind of evidence? Documentary evidence, Your Honor. And a witness. The documents that Alexander's team had uncovered painted a picture that Eleanor Sterling had spent decades hiding. First came the evidence from 1,997 internal memos from Montgomery General Hospital, showing that Richard Sterling III himself had ordered the investigation into Grace Johnson's actions, not because she had violated protocol, but because she had embarrassed him. I will not have it known that a colored girl saved my life, one memo quoted him as saying. Handle this quietly. The courtroom gasped. Eleanor's face went pale. Then came evidence from Sterling Memorial Hospital employment records showing that Grace had been systematically denied promotions, raises, and opportunities for 27 years. Every time she applied for an advanced position, every time she sought to use her nursing skills in any capacity, the application was quietly rejected. Someone had been watching her. Someone had made sure she never rose above her station. And then came the most damning evidence of all. Eleanor Sterling's own emails. Emails from 3 years ago, discussing how to manage Grace Johnson if she ever became a problem. Emails from the night of Noah's birth, sent while Victoria was still dying, asking hospital administrators to ensure that cleaning woman doesn't interfere with Sterling family matters. Emails from 3 weeks later, ordering Grace's termination with instructions to make sure she understands that speaking about anything she witnessed will have consequences. The attorney read them aloud, and with each word, Eleanor Sterling seemed to shrink in her chair. But the final piece of evidence wasn't a document at all. It was a person. The defense calls Dr. Patricia Wells. The head nurse from the night of Noah's birth walked slowly to the witness stand. She looked older than she had 6 months ago, worn down by guilt, perhaps, or by the weight of what she was about to reveal. Dr. Wells, Alexander's attorney began, you were present in the delivery room on the night Noah Sterling was born. Is that correct? Yes. Can you describe what happened after Victoria Sterling passed away? Patricia Wells closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were glistening with tears. It was the worst night of my professional career. We lost Mrs. Sterling despite everything we tried. And then, the baby was there, and he was crying, and no one. Take your time, Dr. Wells. No one would touch him. I've been asking myself why for 6 months, and I don't have a good answer. The blood, maybe. The shock. The grief. But it was more than that. It was like there was something holding us back. Some invisible force. And then Mrs. Johnson entered the room? Yes, the cleaning lady. I'd seen her around for years. Never really noticed her. She just walked in, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And she picked up that baby. And she Patricia Wells was openly crying now. She did what all of us should have done. What we were trained to do. What we were being paid to do. She showed compassion. She showed love. And watching this woman who cleaned our floors do what none of us could manage. It was humbling. And it was beautiful. Dr. Wells, were you present when Eleanor Sterling ordered Mrs. Johnson to stop? I was. What happened? Mrs. Sterling was aggressive. She called security. She threatened Grace with termination, with legal action. She used language that I won't repeat in this courtroom. And what did Mrs. Johnson do? Patricia Wells looked at Grace, and something like reverence crossed her face. She ignored it. She kept holding that baby. She kept speaking to him, softly, telling him he was safe. She didn't fight back. She didn't raise her voice. She just kept doing what was right, no matter what anyone else said. In your professional opinion, Dr. Wells, how did Mrs. Johnson's actions affect Noah Sterling? They saved him. Can you elaborate? Newborns need touch. They need warmth. They need human connection. When those things are denied in the first minutes of life, there can be lasting effects, attachment disorders, developmental issues, psychological trauma. Noah Sterling was denied those things for nearly 4 minutes. 4 minutes that could have changed his entire life. She paused, looking at Grace again. Grace Johnson gave him that touch, that warmth, that connection. She bridged the gap between his mother's death and his father's recovery. She held him until someone else was ready to hold him, and in doing so, she gave that child something no money could buy, a foundation of love. The courtroom was silent. One more question, Dr. Wells. In your 20 years of medical practice, have you ever seen someone do what Mrs. Johnson did that night? Patricia Wells shook her head slowly. Never. I've seen heroics. I've seen bravery. I've seen people do incredible things under pressure. But I've never seen someone walk into a room full of people who had more power than her, more status than her, more reason to push her away, and just love anyway. Just do what was right anyway. She turned to face the judge directly. Your Honor, I don't know what the law says about custody and qualifications and backgrounds. I'm just a nurse. But I know what I saw that night. I saw someone who cared about a child more than she cared about herself. And in my experience, that's the only qualification that truly matters. The judge called a recess to review the new evidence. When court reconvened 2 hours later, the atmosphere had completely changed. Eleanor Sterling's team of expensive lawyers looked deflated. The whisper campaign that had painted Alexander as unstable now seemed cruel and calculated. The narrative of a scheming black woman manipulating a grieving billionaire had collapsed entirely, replaced by its opposite. A story of a woman who had been wronged, who had survived, and who had responded to cruelty with compassion. The judge, a 60-year-old woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, addressed the courtroom. I've reviewed the evidence presented in this case, both old and new. I've listened to testimony from medical professionals, family members, and the individuals at the center of this dispute, and I have reached a decision. She turned to Eleanor Sterling. Mrs. Sterling, your petition for custody is denied. Eleanor's face went white. Furthermore, I am referring the evidence of harassment, interference with medical care, and retaliatory employment practices to the appropriate authorities for further investigation. The systematic mistreatment of Grace Johnson over a period of 27 years represents a pattern of behavior that this court finds deeply troubling. She turned to Alexander. Mr. Sterling, you are a grieving man who has made unconventional choices in how you care for your son. But the evidence shows that those choices have been made with Noah's best interests at heart. Mrs. Johnson's presence in your household has stabilized your child, supported your recovery, and demonstrated exactly the kind of love that every child deserves. Finally, she turned to Grace. Mrs. Johnson, I have rarely seen a clearer case of someone being punished for doing the right thing. What happened to you in 1997 was unjust. What continued to happen to you for the next 27 years was unconscionable. And yet, you persevered. You survived. And when the opportunity came to help another child, the grandchild of the man who destroyed your career, you didn't hesitate. You didn't seek revenge. You simply loved. The judge paused, her voice softening. This court cannot undo the past, but it can ensure that the future is better. Full custody of Noah Sterling is awarded to his father, Alexander Sterling, and I am recommending that the State Board of Nursing formally apologize for the wrongful revocation of Mrs. Johnson's license and expunge all negative records from her file. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Johnson, one last thing. Grace looked up. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen the worst of humanity. I have seen people destroy each other over money, power, and petty grievances. But I have also seen the best. I have seen people rise above their circumstances, forgive those who wronged them, and choose love over hate. The judge smiled, a rare expression that transformed her stern face. You, Mrs. Johnson, are the best. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. The courtroom erupted in applause. The aftermath of the trial was swift and far-reaching. Eleanor Sterling, facing multiple investigations and the total collapse of her social standing, retreated to her estate in the Hamptons. The society friends, who had echoed her whisper campaign, suddenly discovered pressing engagements that kept them away. The judges and politicians, who had once taken her calls, stopped answering. She was not arrested. She was not imprisoned. But for a woman who had lived her entire life for status and influence, the loss of both was perhaps a worse punishment. 2 years after the trial, Alexander received a letter from her. It was the first communication they had had since that day in the courtroom. Alexander, I am old, I am tired, and I have spent the past 2 years thinking about everything I did and why I did it. I cannot apologize. I have lived too long to believe that words can undo actions. But I can admit that I was wrong. About Grace. About Victoria. About what matters in life. Your grandfather taught me that power was everything. He was wrong. I spent my whole life learning the wrong lessons from the wrong people. Take care of Noah, and take care of Grace. She is a better person than I ever was or ever could be. Mother. Alexander never responded. Some wounds don't heal. Some relationships can't be repaired. He had made peace with that, but he kept the letter. And sometimes, late at night, when Noah was sleeping and Grace was resting and the penthouse was quiet, he would read it again, not to forgive her, not yet, maybe not ever, but to remember that even the worst people can sometimes see the truth. 5 years after the trial, the Sterling penthouse looked different. The cold, minimalist furniture that Victoria had hated had been replaced with warm, comfortable pieces. Family photos, real family photos, not the staged professional shots that had once decorated the walls, hung everywhere. Plants that Grace had brought from her Bronx apartment flourished in every room, and at the center of it all was Noah. He was 5 years old now, a bright, joyful child who had inherited his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn determination. He called Alexander Daddy and called Grace Nana G, and he thought it was perfectly normal that his family looked like this. Nana G, Noah said one morning over breakfast, why do people at school say we're different? Grace and Alexander exchanged a look. They had known this question was coming. What do you mean, baby? Grace asked. Tommy said his Nana has white skin like him, and his daddy has white skin. But my Nana G has brown skin, and my daddy has white skin. And Tommy said that's weird. Alexander set down his coffee cup. Noah, do you think it's weird? Noah considered this with the seriousness that only a 5-year-old can muster. No, he said finally. I think it's nice. I get 2 colors of hugs. Grace laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the kitchen. 2 colors of hugs. I like that. Baby, Alexander said, kneeling down to look his son in the eye. Some people think families have to look a certain way. They think everyone has to match. But that's not true. Families are made of people who love each other. That's the only thing that matters. Did Mommy match? Alexander felt the familiar pang that always came when Victoria was mentioned, softer now, after 5 years, but still present. "Mommy looked like you," he said. "She had the same eyes, the same smile, and she loved you more than anything in the world." "And she loved Nana G?" Alexander looked at Grace, who nodded. "She never met Nana G," Alexander said carefully. "But I know in my heart that she would have loved her. Because Mommy loved people who were brave and kind and strong, and Nana G is all of those things." Noah considered this. "Okay," he said. "Can I have more pancakes?" Grace laughed again, and Alexander felt something release in his chest, something that had been tight for 5 years. This was his family. Unconventional, unexpected, built from tragedy and held together by love. And it was everything Victoria had wanted for their son. When Noah was 7, Grace received an offer that would change everything. The New York State Board of Nursing, in recognition of both the wrongful revocation of her license and her exemplary service in the years since its reinstatement, offered her the position of Director of Nursing Standards. It was the highest honor they could bestow. It came with influence, prestige, and the ability to ensure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. Grace sat with the offer letter for 3 days. On the 4th day, Alexander found her in the kitchen, looking out at Central Park. "You're thinking about taking it," he said. "I'm thinking about everything." He sat down across from her, the same way they had sat in her Bronx apartment all those years ago. "Grace, if you want this, you should take it." Grace shook her head slowly. "That's not what I'm wrestling with." "Then what?" She turned to look at him, this man who had been transformed by grief and love, who had become so different from the cold billionaire he had been when they first met. 30 years ago, I had a choice. I could stay at my station, follow the rules, and watch a man die. Or I could break the rules and save him. I chose to save him, and it cost me everything. I know. 7 years ago, I had another choice. I could walk past that delivery room, keep my head down, and let someone else handle the crying baby. Or I could go in and do what needed to be done, knowing it could cost me everything again. And you went in. I went in, because that's who I am. That's who I've always been. The person who goes in. She picked up the offer letter. "This job is important. It would let me help nurses all over the state, make sure they're never punished for doing the right thing. It's good work. Meaningful work. But it would take me away from Noah, from you, from this family we've built. And I keep asking myself, is that the right choice? Is the greater good more important than the people right in front of me?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Grace, can I tell you something Victoria said to me once?" "Always." We were talking about her work. She was the best pediatric heart surgeon in the country, and she was constantly being recruited by research institutions, places where she could have advanced cardiac medicine, saved thousands of lives over the course of her career. But she always said no. Why? Because she believed that the world changes one child at a time. Not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through individual acts of love and care. She said that if she spent her life trying to save the world, she'd lose sight of the person right in front of her. And that person was the only one she could actually help. Grace's eyes were glistening. "She sounds like someone I would have loved." She was. And Grace, you're someone she would have loved too. Someone who has dedicated her life to being present for the people who need her most. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Whatever you decide, it's the right choice. Because you'll make it for the right reasons. But if you want my opinion and you can absolutely ignore it, I think there's a 7-year-old boy who needs his Nana G more than the nursing board needs a new director." Grace laughed softly. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher." She looked at the offer letter one more time. Then she set it down. "I think I'll stay right where I am." 20 years after the night that changed everything, Grace Johnson stood at the back of a crowded auditorium, watching a young man walk across a stage to accept his diploma. Noah Sterling had just graduated from Columbia University with highest honors in social work. He had turned down his father's offers to join Sterling Capital. He had turned down the family's expectations that he would take over the business empire. Instead, he had chosen to work with children in foster care, kids who had never known stability, never known love, never known what it meant to have someone in their corner. "My mother died giving birth to me," Noah said in his graduation speech. The audience hushed and attentive. For the first 4 minutes of my life, no one would touch me. I was alone in a room full of people, crying for help that wouldn't come. Grace felt Alexander's hand find hers. She squeezed it tight. And then a woman walked in. A woman who had been wronged by my family. A woman who had every reason to walk past that room and keep her head down. A woman who had spent 27 years being invisible to people like us. Noah paused, his eyes finding Grace in the crowd. She didn't walk past. She walked in. She picked me up. She held me. She gave me my first bath. And she loved me not because I was a sterling, not because my father was rich, but because I was a baby who needed help. Tears were streaming down Grace's face now. That woman taught me everything I know about courage, about compassion, about what it means to show up for someone even when it costs you. She taught me that the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they do when no one's watching. It's who they are to people who can do absolutely nothing for them. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. I'm going to spend my life working with children who feel invisible. Children who feel alone. Children who are crying for help in rooms full of people who won't respond. And when I find them, I'm going to do what she did for me. He smiled Victoria's smile, Alexander realized, with tears in his own eyes. I'm going to walk in. The audience erupted in applause. And Grace Johnson, 73 years old, still standing, still strong, still loving with everything she had, Grace Johnson let herself cry. Grace Johnson died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning when she was 81 years old. Noah was at her bedside. So was Alexander, now in his 60s, still carrying the weight of loss but surrounded by love. So were Grace's own children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a vast, beautiful family that had grown around her like a garden around a fountain. The funeral was held at a small church in the Bronx, not far from the apartment where she had lived for so many years. It was standing room only. Noah gave the eulogy. My grandmother, my Nana G, never asked for recognition. She never sought fame or fortune. She never wanted anything, except to be useful, to help, to do some good, in a world that tried very hard to stop people like her from doing good. He paused, composing himself. She succeeded. In ways small and large, seen and unseen, she made the world better. She made me better. She made my father better. She made everyone who knew her better. He looked at the casket, draped in flowers, wildflowers, at Grace's request, not expensive arrangements. When I was born, I was alone. I was afraid. I was crying for help. And a woman walked in. She picked me up. She held me. She loved me. His voice cracked, but he continued. For the rest of my life, whenever I feel alone, whenever I feel afraid, whenever I'm crying for help in the darkness, I will remember that moment. I will remember her hands. I will remember her voice. I will remember the way she made me feel safe when nothing else could. He stepped back from the podium. Rest now, Nana G. You've earned it. You've more than earned it. After the service, Alexander stood alone at the grave. Long after everyone else had left, he had brought something with him, a letter that Victoria had written before Noah was born, instructions for her husband in case the worst happened. He had never shared it with anyone, not even Grace. But now, as the sun set over the cemetery, he read it aloud. My love, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're raising our son alone. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I can't be there to help you, to guide you, to love you both through the hard days ahead. But here's what I need you to know. You are capable of so much more than you believe. The cold, calculating man you were taught to be, that's not who you really are. I saw glimpses of the real you, the loving you, the you who could change the world if you just let yourself feel. Find someone to help you. Not a nanny from an agency. Not a professional caregiver with a perfect resume. Find someone with a warm heart and gentle hands. Find someone who will love our son the way I would have loved him. Find someone who sees people really sees them the way I tried to see you. And when you find that person, hold on to them, trust them, Let them teach you how to be human. I believe in you. I have always believed in you. With all my love, forever, Victoria. Alexander folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. I found her, Victoria, he whispered to the empty air. I found exactly who you described, and she was everything you wanted for our son. Everything and more. He placed his hand on Grace's gravestone, feeling the cool marble beneath his fingers. Thank you, he said, for Noah, for me, for everything. Then Alexander Sterling walked away from the cemetery, toward the car where his son was waiting, toward the life that Grace Johnson's love had made possible. And somewhere in a place beyond pain, beyond injustice, beyond the cold cruelty of a world that had tried so hard to break her, Grace Johnson smiled. She had done what anyone would do. She had loved, and that love would echo forward through generations, touching lives she would never meet, changing hearts she would never know, proving over and over again that the smallest act of compassion can reshape the entire world.